They mocked the homeless veteran's plea for food. Unaware, he carried the mind of an engineering genius. "Can I solve it for food?" the homeless veteran muttered, ignored by the crowd that mocked him. None of them knew this man had once helped shape the very machines now failing before their eyes. Acrid smoke poured from Davenport Aeronautics prototype as billionaire Mark Davenport barked orders into his phone, desperation cracking his polished exterior. A $40 billion contract, and his company's future, were seconds from going up in flames. Engineers scrambled, clueless. And then, through the jeers, James Callahan stepped forward. Worn boots, weathered hands, a voice rough but steady. "I know what's wrong with your machine." Laughter rippled. How could a starving man from the streets know more than the brightest minds in aerospace? What they didn't realize was that he already did. Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. A man forgotten by the world he helped build was about to get a second chance. But first, he would have to endure their scorn, unaware that their multi-billion-dollar project rested entirely in his hands. The city woke up in shifts. First came the distant rumble of sanitation trucks, then the rhythmic hiss of street sweepers, and finally, the growing hum of early commuter traffic. For James Callahan, the city's alarm clock was the gradual lightening of the sky from inky black to a bruised purple, visible through the steel girders of the overpass he called home. He had once commanded men who commanded the sky. Now he commanded only a small, hidden space between concrete and steel, a kingdom of cardboard and a single, threadbare army blanket. 3 years. Had it really been 3 years since he'd had a roof that wasn't a bridge? Since he'd had a meal that didn't come from a bin or the strained kindness of a stranger? The memories of his old life were like faded photographs. He could recall the feelings, the weight of responsibility, the thrill of solving an impossible problem, the quiet pride of a job well done, but the details were often blurry, as if they belonged to another man. James sat up, his joints protesting the cold that had seeped in overnight. He moved with a deliberate, practiced economy. Every motion had a purpose. He folded his blanket into a perfect square, a habit drilled into him decades ago at Fort Bragg. It was a small act of order in a life defined by chaos. His worldly possessions fit into a battered army surplus backpack, a canteen, a worn copy of a physics textbook, a small toolkit he'd pieced together from discarded items, and his last remaining photograph. The picture showed a younger James, smiling, in full dress uniform, standing beside a woman with kind eyes. He hadn't looked at it in months. The pain was still too sharp. His routine was unchangeable, a ritual that kept him anchored. First, the public restroom at the park, a place he used with the speed and efficiency of a soldier breaking down a field position. He washed his face with cold water, the shock of it a welcome jolt to his senses. He ran a wet hand through his graying hair and combed his beard with his fingers. He had to look presentable, or as presentable as a man in his situation could. Being invisible was a survival tactic, but being seen as a threat was a danger he couldn't afford. Next was the public library. It was his sanctuary, his connection to the man he used to be. The librarians knew him. They saw the intelligence in his quiet eyes and the respect with which he handled the books. They never hurried him, even when he sometimes stayed from opening until closing, reading complex engineering journals and technical manuals. He wasn't just passing time. He was keeping his mind sharp. A soldier's greatest weapon wasn't his rifle, it was his mind. That, too, had been drilled into him, and his mind was all he had left. Today, however, his routine was broken. As he walked toward the library, a commotion a few blocks away caught his attention. A crowd was gathering near the entrance of Davenport Aeronautics, a gleaming glass tower that scraped the sky. It was the heart of the city's burgeoning tech sector, a world that had once been his. James felt the familiar pang of an outsider looking in. The people rushing past him, with their expensive suits and important phone calls, lived in a different universe. To them, he was just a piece of the urban landscape, easily ignored. But it wasn't the building that drew the crowd. It was what sat in the plaza in front of it. A machine. It was a sleek, menacing craft, more of a high-tech drone than a traditional vehicle. Its body was made of a matte black composite material that seemed to drink the morning light. It rested on a specialized transport platform, and a team of engineers in matching blue jumpsuits swarmed around it, their faces etched with panic. James recognized it instantly. It was the Prometheus, Davenport Aeronautics bid for the next generation of unmanned aerial surveillance. He had read about it in the journals at the library. It was a marvel of modern engineering, boasting a revolutionary propulsion system and an advanced sensor suite. It was also, at this particular moment, a multi-billion-dollar failure. A thick, acrid smoke, the color of a sickened sky, poured from a panel on its side. The controlled, powerful hum it was supposed to emit was replaced by a sputtering, discordant whine. James could hear the sound from half a block away, and it set his teeth on edge. It was the sound of something deeply, fundamentally wrong. It was the sound of a resonance cascade, a catastrophic feedback loop that, if left unchecked, would tear the machine apart from the inside out. He knew that sound. He had heard it once before, in a simulation, years ago. A simulation he himself had designed. He moved closer, his curiosity overriding his instinct to remain invisible. He navigated the edge of the crowd, his movements slow and unassuming. He saw a man in a perfectly tailored Italian suit pacing frantically, his face a mask of fury and desperation. This was Mark Davenport, the charismatic billionaire, the boy genius of the aerospace world. His face was on the cover of magazines, his interviews replayed on business channels. Today, his polished image was cracking under the strain. Get it fixed. Now, Davenport barked into his phone. The DoD delegation is landing in 2 hours. 2 hours. Do you have any idea what's on the line? He listened for a moment, his face growing darker. I don't care what your diagnostics say. I have a $40 billion contract hanging in the balance, and our flagship prototype is smoking like a cheap cigar in my front yard. He snapped the phone shut and turned to a younger engineer, who flinched under his boss's fiery gaze. What's the status? We don't know, Mr. Davenport, the engineer stammered. The thermal regulation system is in a feedback loop. We can't shut it down without risking a full core meltdown. But if we leave it running, the gyroscopic stabilizer is going to tear itself from its moorings. So, you're telling me it's going to either melt or explode? Davenport said, his voice dangerously low. That's my choice. James watched, his mind already working the problem. He saw the pattern of the smoke. He analyzed the pitch of the whine. He noted which engineers were checking which systems. They were looking in all the wrong places. They were treating the symptom, the heat, without understanding the cause. The cause wasn't the thermal system. That was just the first thing to break. The real problem was in the power distribution manifold, a flaw in the design he had warned the industry about in a paper he'd published 6 years ago. A paper that had been largely ignored. He felt a familiar ache in his gut. It wasn't hunger, not this time. It was the frustration of a craftsman watching someone use a beautiful tool all wrong. He knew how to fix it. He could probably do it with a few basic tools in under 30 minutes. But what could he do? He was a ghost. A man in worn clothes with no name and no standing. If he approached them, they would see a beggar, a madman. Security would be called. He would be shoved away, another piece of human debris cleared from the pristine sidewalk of progress. He watched Davenport's panic escalate. The billionaire's reputation was built on flawlessness, on delivering the future on time and under budget. The scene unfolding in his plaza was a public relations nightmare. News vans were already arriving, their cameras like vultures circling a kill. James felt a different sensation now, overriding his caution. It was a sense of duty. He had sworn an oath once to protect and defend. That oath hadn't been about a flag or a country, not really. It had been about protecting people, about solving problems that threatened them. This machine, if it failed catastrophically, could endanger the entire city block. That was a problem, and he was a problem solver. He also felt hunger. It was a deep, gnawing emptiness that had been his constant companion for 3 years. His last meal had been half a sandwich he'd found in a trash can the previous evening. He was tired. He was cold. And he knew the answer to the billion-dollar question that was making Mark Davenport sweat through his expensive suit. He took a slow, deliberate breath. He squared his shoulders, a subtle shift that straightened his spine and brought a flicker of the command he once held to his bearing. He pushed through the edge of the murmuring crowd. People parted for him, their expressions a mixture of pity and disgust. He ignored them. His focus was on Mark Davenport. He stopped a respectful 10 feet away. He waited for a moment when Davenport wasn't yelling at an underling. Sir, James said. His voice was rough from disuse, but it was steady. Davenport didn't even look at him. Not now, he snapped, waving a dismissive hand. Get out of here. Sir, James repeated, his voice a little louder, a little firmer. I know what's wrong with your machine. This time, Davenport turned. His eyes, the color of cold steel, scanned James from head to toe. He saw the frayed collar of his jacket, the worn-out boots, the unkempt beard. His face twisted into a sneer of disbelief and contempt. You do you? Davenport scoffed. A few people nearby snickered. And I suppose you're a rocket scientist on your lunch break? The mockery stung, but James's face remained a placid mask. He had endured far worse from far more dangerous men. He met the billionaire's gaze without flinching. His eyes were calm, clear, and intelligent. They held a depth that seemed entirely out of place with the rest of his appearance. No, sir, James replied evenly. I'm just hungry. He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. He made his offer, the only one he could. The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of his entire, desperate situation. Can I solve it for food? The laughter was louder this time. It started with Davenport, a short, sharp bark of incredulous amusement, and it rippled through the onlookers. They saw the scene as a piece of street theater. The crazy homeless man offering to fix the billion-dollar spaceship for a sandwich. It was absurd. It was pathetic. Solve it for food, Davenport repeated, shaking his head as if to clear it of a bad dream. Listen, old man. I appreciate the offer, but my team of world-class engineers with PhDs from MIT and Caltech seem to be having a little trouble. What makes you think you can do anything but get in the way? James's gaze didn't waver. Because they're looking at the heat. The problem isn't the heat. It's a harmonic resonance in the power converter. It's creating a feedback loop that's superheating the coolant. Your thermal regulation system isn't failing. It's doing its job, but it's being overwhelmed by a problem it wasn't designed to handle. The confident, technical precision of the statement silenced the laughter. The smirk on Davenport's face faltered. The engineers who had overheard turned to look at James, their expressions shifting from amusement to confusion. How could this man possibly know those terms? Davenport's eyes narrowed. Who are you? A man who knows that if you don't bypass the primary power manifold and reroute it through the auxiliary conduits in the next 20 minutes, your gyroscopic stabilizer will fail. When it does, it will shear through the primary coolant lines. The resulting explosion will not only destroy your prototype, it will shatter every window in a 2-block radius. James delivered the words not as a threat, but as a simple, undeniable statement of fact. A bead of sweat trickled down Mark Davenport's temple. He looked at his chief engineer, who was staring at James with his mouth slightly agape. Is he right? Davenport asked, his voice now a strained whisper. The engineer swallowed hard. The stabilizer's vibration sensors are redlining, sir. We thought it was a symptom of the heat, a calibration error, but what he's describing, it's a plausible scenario. A very, very bad one. Davenport turned back to James. The contempt in his eyes was gone, replaced by a dawning, horrified suspicion. This wasn't a madman. This was something else entirely. And in that moment, with his legacy smoking on the launch pad and the world watching, Mark Davenport realized his only hope might just be the homeless man who had offered to save his empire for the price of a meal. The silence that fell over the plaza was heavy and thick. The discordant whine of the Prometheus prototype was the only sound, a constant reminder of the disaster ticking away. The crowd, sensing a dramatic shift, pushed closer, their phones held up to capture whatever happened next. They had come for a spectacle of failure. They were now witnessing a mystery. Mark Davenport stared at James, his mind racing. Every instinct he had, honed by years of boardroom battles and high-stakes negotiations, screamed that this was impossible. And yet, the man's diagnosis had been too specific, too confident. It carried the ring of truth, a truth his own highly paid experts had missed. How? Davenport finally managed to say, the word a mix of demand and genuine confusion. How could you possibly know that? I read, James said simply. The public library has an excellent technical section. Your company's design schematics, the ones released to the public for academic review, have a flaw. A small one. Easy to overlook. But under the specific atmospheric conditions of a morning like this, the humidity, the barometric pressure, it can trigger a cascade failure. Davenport's face went pale. He knew which schematics James was talking about. They had been released 6 years ago for a much earlier version of the propulsion system. No one, not even his own internal review teams, had ever connected them to a potential failure in the Prometheus. That's proprietary information, one of the engineers muttered, loud enough for Davenport to hear. Those early designs are the foundation of the current system. James finished for him, his gaze still locked on Davenport. You upgraded the components, but you never fixed the fundamental flaw in the architecture. You built a skyscraper on a cracked foundation. Suspicion hardened Davenport's features again. This couldn't be a coincidence. Is this a setup? Did one of my competitors put you up to this? Is this some kind of industrial espionage? James almost smiled. The thought was so absurd it was almost funny. He, a man whose greatest strategic challenge each day was finding a safe place to sleep, accused of being a corporate spy. No, sir. I have no competitors. I have no allies. I just have a problem I know how to solve. And you have about 15 minutes left to let me do it. As if on cue, a new, more alarming sound joined the whine, a rhythmic, metallic clanking. That's the stabilizer's housing, the chief engineer said, his voice trembling. The bolts are starting to shear. Panic, cold and sharp, finally broke through Davenport's pride. His empire was literally shaking itself to pieces in front of him. His legacy was on the verge of becoming a crater. He looked at his own team, who were staring helplessly at their tablets, their faces blank with incomprehension. Then he looked back at the homeless man, whose calm demeanor was the only point of stability in the unfolding chaos. What do you need? Davenport asked, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. The maintenance toolkit from the transport vehicle, James said without hesitation. And I'll need you to clear the area. Your engineers are brave, but they're a distraction. I need everyone who isn't essential to be at least 100 yards away. Davenport didn't question it. He was a man who understood command. When someone spoke with absolute authority, you listened. You heard him, he yelled at his team. Get the kit. Everyone else, back off. Now, the engineers scrambled to obey. The crowd was pushed back by Davenport's personal security, who had been watching the exchange with stunned disbelief. One of the guards, a burly man named Peterson, moved to stand near James, his posture wary. Sir, are you sure about this? Peterson murmured to Davenport. We haven't vetted this man. He has no ID, no credentials. This is a massive security risk. The bigger risk right now is a $40 billion firework display, Davenport shot back. Just watch him. If he makes one move that looks wrong, you stop him. A young engineer ran up with a heavy-duty steel case and placed it at James's feet. James knelt down and unlatched it. His hands moved over the neatly arranged tools with a familiarity that was startling. He selected a wrench, a set of wire cutters, and a diagnostic probe. His movements were fluid and certain. He wasn't fumbling or guessing. He was a master craftsman selecting his instruments. He walked toward the smoking machine. The heat radiating from it was intense, but he didn't even flinch. He found the access panel, and with a few deft movements, he unlatched the security bolts and pulled it free. The cloud of acrid smoke billowed out, thicker and more noxious. James didn't hesitate. He leaned into the opening, his eyes scanning the complex labyrinth of wires, conduits, and processors within. It was a beautiful, chaotic mess of cutting-edge technology. And he saw the heart of the problem immediately. A small converter unit, no bigger than a shoebox, was glowing with a faint, malevolent red light. It was vibrating violently, the source of the entire cascade. Mr. Davenport, James called out, his voice slightly muffled. I need you to get your chief engineer on the line with your command center. He needs to remotely unlock maintenance override protocol 7 Alpha 9er. Davenport relayed the order. The chief engineer fumbled with his phone, his hands shaking. 7 Alpha 9er? Sir, that's a deep core system command. It bypasses all safety protocols. If he makes a mistake, just do it, Davenport roared. James waited patiently, his hand hovering over a thick, shielded cable. He could hear the engineer nervously relaying the command. A moment later, a small LED on the panel in front of James blinked from red to green. Override engaged, James said to himself. He took the wire cutters. In one smooth, confident motion, he cut the primary power cable. The terrible whining sound stopped instantly. The clanking of the stabilizer ceased. The only sound was the hiss of the overworked cooling fans beginning to slow. A collective sigh of relief went through the small group of engineers watching from a distance. Davenport felt his knees go weak. "It's over?" he asked, daring to hope. "No," James replied from inside the machine. "That just stopped the bleeding. Now I have to perform the surgery." For the next 10 minutes, James worked in silence. His hands were a blur of motion inside the cramped compartment. He rerouted cables, bypassed the faulty converter, and patched the auxiliary power line directly into the main grid. It was a delicate and dangerous operation. One wrong connection could send a fatal surge through the system, frying every component and turning the Prometheus into a very expensive paperweight. Davenport and his team watched on a large monitor that showed the drone's internal diagnostics. They saw power levels fluctuating wildly as James worked. Error messages flashed across the screen in angry red letters. "He's going to brick the whole system," one engineer whispered. "Shut up," Davenport hissed, his eyes glued to the screen. Then, as quickly as the chaos had started, it began to resolve. The error messages vanished one by one. System indicators on the monitor flickered from red to yellow, and then, miraculously, to a steady, solid green. The temperature inside the core, which had been dangerously high, began to drop rapidly. James pulled his head and shoulders out of the access panel. He had a smudge of grease on his cheek, and his hands were dirty, but his eyes were clear. He looked at the chief engineer. "You can bring it back online now," he said. "Start with the auxiliary power, then initiate a full system reboot. It will take about 3 minutes." The engineer, looking to his boss for confirmation, saw Davenport nod. He typed the commands into his tablet. On the transport platform, the Prometheus, which had been silent and dark, came back to life. A series of soft clicks and whirs emanated from within. Its external lights pulsed once, then settled into a low, healthy blue glow. The powerful, controlled hum of a perfectly functioning machine filled the plaza. There was no smoke. There was no whine. It was fixed. The crowd, which had been held back by security, erupted into a smattering of applause. The news crews began chattering excitedly into their microphones. Mark Davenport walked slowly toward James, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. This man, this homeless stranger, had just done what his entire team of experts had deemed impossible. He had done it with a few basic tools and an encyclopedic knowledge of a system he shouldn't have understood. He stopped in front of James. The air between them was thick with unspoken questions. I don't know what to say," Davenport began. "You saved it. You saved everything." James simply nodded. He wiped his hands on a rag from the toolkit. He was already detaching, the problem solver receding, the weary, hungry man returning. His job was done. "You're welcome," he said quietly. "I owe you," Davenport said, his voice filled with a genuine sense of awe and gratitude. "More than I can say. Name your price." "Anything." James looked at the billionaire. He looked at the gleaming tower of Davenport Aeronautics. He looked at the perfectly functioning, multi-billion-dollar machine he had just saved. Then he remembered the simple, desperate bargain he had tried to make just 30 minutes earlier. His gaze was steady, and his voice held no trace of bitterness, only a quiet, profound weariness. "A deal is a deal, Mr. Davenport," James said. "I'll have a cheeseburger. And a cup of coffee. Black." The request was so simple, so jarringly out of scale with the magnitude of what he had just accomplished, that it left Mark Davenport utterly speechless. He was prepared to offer a fortune. He was being asked for a meal. It was in that moment of profound disconnect that Davenport began to understand that the real mystery wasn't how this man had fixed his machine. The real mystery was the man himself. The inside of Mark Davenport's office was like stepping into another world. Located on the top floor of the tower, it had floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a godlike view of the city below. The furniture was sleek and minimalist, a collection of chrome, glass, and dark leather that screamed money and power. On one wall, a massive screen silently displayed stock market data and global news feeds. It was a room built for a king, the throne room of a modern technological empire. James Callahan sat in a leather chair that probably cost more than he had earned in the last decade of his previous life. He felt profoundly out of place. A few minutes earlier, Davenport's personal assistant, a young woman with a harried but efficient air, had brought in the promised meal on a silver tray. It wasn't just a cheeseburger. It was a gourmet creation from the building's executive dining room, accompanied by perfectly crisp fries and a steaming mug of what smelled like expensive imported coffee. James ate slowly, methodically. He didn't devour the food like a starving man, though he was. He ate with a quiet dignity, the same focused precision he had applied to fixing the Prometheus. Each bite was deliberate. Each sip of coffee savored. He was refueling, not just indulging. Mark Davenport sat behind his massive desk, not working, but watching his guest. The initial shock and gratitude had given way to an all-consuming curiosity. He had sent his shaken engineering team to run a full diagnostic on the prototype, and his PR team to spin the morning's near disaster into a story of an unexpected on-site system test. But his mind was consumed by the man sitting across from him. "You have to understand," Davenport began, breaking the silence, "that what you did out there, it's not supposed to be possible. My chief engineer, David Chun, has 2 doctorates from Stanford. He leads a team of 150 of the brightest minds in the industry. They were completely lost. And you walked up off the street and solved it in 15 minutes. James finished a fry and wiped his mouth with a linen napkin. "Dr. Chun is a brilliant man," he said, his voice even. "I've read some of his papers on quantum computing. But he's a theorist. He understands the why better than almost anyone. I've always been better at the how. And how did you learn the how?" Davenport pressed, leaning forward. "You mentioned the library. I'm sorry, but I don't buy that. You didn't just diagnose the problem. You knew the override codes. You knew the specific rerouting procedure. That's not in a public journal. That's classified, deep-level system knowledge." James took a slow sip of coffee. He looked out the window at the sprawling city. From this height, the people on the streets were just tiny, insignificant specks. It was easy to forget they were real, that they had lives and stories. He knew what it was like to be one of those specks. "You're right," he conceded. "It's not in a journal." He paused, deciding how much to reveal. The habit of secrecy, of a life lived in the shadows of classified projects, was hard to break. But Davenport deserved an answer. More than that, James felt a strange, unburdening need to speak his own name, to reclaim a piece of the man he had been. "My name is James Callahan," he said. The name felt foreign on his own tongue. "I used to be Sergeant Major James Callahan, United States Army. I was a combat engineer, Special Projects Division." Davenport's eyes widened slightly. He typed the name into the tablet embedded in his desk. He was a man who believed in data, and he needed data now. What came up was sparse, a heavily redacted public service record. Date of enlistment. A long list of commendations, most of them with the descriptions blacked out. An honorable discharge 3 years ago. Nothing else. No mention of special projects, no details of his service. "A ghost in the machine. A combat engineer," Davenport repeated, looking up from the screen. "That doesn't explain how you knew the intimate details of my proprietary propulsion system. My last assignment was with a special task force at DARPA," James explained, his voice low and devoid of emotion. "We were red-teaming next-generation defense technologies. Our job was to be the adversary. We were given new prototypes, new systems, and it was our job to break them, to find their flaws before our enemies did. For 2 years, my entire life was focused on one thing, the precursor to your Prometheus engine." The pieces clicked into place in Davenport's mind. "The Ethelred Project," he breathed. It was a legendary, failed government project that had cost taxpayers billions. It was the direct ancestor of his own technology. The contractor who built that, it was Aerodyne Systems. "My biggest competitor." "That's right," James said. "They built it. My team broke it. We found 17 critical design flaws. The one that almost destroyed your machine today was number 9 on our list. I wrote the report on it myself. A detailed 300-page analysis of the harmonic resonance cascade." "I never saw that report," Davenport said, frowning. "We did our due diligence when we acquired Aerodyne's patents after they went under. That report was never in the data transfer." A bitter, humorless smile touched James's lips. "I'm not surprised. The report was classified, buried. Admitting a flaw that fundamental would have meant scrapping the entire project and starting over. There were too many careers, too many fortunes tied to the Ethelred project. It was easier to bury the report and the man who wrote it. The story was starting to take shape, a dark and unsettling picture of corporate and military politics. What happened? Davenport asked, his voice softer now. James fell silent. He looked down at his hands, which were clean for the first time in ages. But he could still feel the grime, the grit of the streets, embedded deep in his skin. He remembered the final field test. The desert sun, the smell of ozone, the sound, the same terrible, whining sound he had heard this morning. There was an incident, he said, the words heavy with unspoken trauma. A live fire demonstration for a congressional oversight committee. The brass was all there. Generals, senators, the CEO of Aerodyne. They had been warned. I told my commanding officer, Colonel Bishop, that the conditions weren't safe. The humidity was too high. The same trigger as today. He was under a lot of pressure to deliver. He ignored my warning. James closed his eyes for a second. They powered it up. The cascade started almost immediately. We tried to shut it down, but it was too late. The prototype exploded. 2 good men died. Technicians. Young kids with families. I was the senior NCO on site. The one who had written the report. I was the perfect scapegoat. The air in the luxurious office grew cold. Davenport felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. This wasn't just a story about a failed project anymore. It was about lives lost and a life destroyed. They couldn't court-martial me, James continued, his voice flat. That would mean my report would become evidence in a public record. So they buried me another way. A formal reprimand for procedural missteps. An honorable discharge, but with a black mark on my confidential record that ensured I would never work in the defense industry or any related field ever again. They discredited me, spread rumors that I was unstable, difficult. In the space of 6 months, I went from being one of the military's top engineers to an unemployable pariah. He opened his eyes and looked at Davenport. The pain in them was raw, an abyss of loss and injustice. My wife, Sarah, she got sick around the same time. An aggressive cancer. The medical bills wiped out our savings. When the Army cut off my pension and my healthcare benefits as part of the discharge, I couldn't afford her treatments anymore. She died 6 months later. He took a shaky breath. After that, I lost everything. The house, the car, my will to fight. I just drifted. And one day I woke up on a park bench, and I realized 3 years had gone by. The silence in the room was absolute. The city outside seemed to have disappeared. There was only the quiet, devastating grief of a good man who had been failed by the very system he had dedicated his life to serving. Mark Davenport, a man who prided himself on his control, on his ability to read any situation and any person, felt utterly adrift. He had built an empire on logic, data, and ruthless ambition. But the story he had just heard defied all of that. It was a story of profound, systemic injustice, the kind that didn't show up on a spreadsheet. He looked at James Callahan, really looked at him for the first time. He didn't see a homeless man anymore. He saw a soldier, a hero, a genius, a man who had been to hell and back, and who had still found it within himself to step forward and offer help, not for fame or fortune, but for a simple meal. Callahan, Davenport began, his voice hoarse. James, I had no idea. Most people don't, James said, his composure returning. It's easier that way. Davenport stood up and walked to the window, his back to James. He looked down at the plaza, where his engineers were now carefully securing the Prometheus, the machine James had saved. His $40 billion contract with the Department of Defense was probably secure. His company's stock would soar. His legacy was intact. And it was all thanks to a man the world had thrown away like trash. A deep, unfamiliar sense of shame washed over him. He had looked at James and seen nothing but a nuisance. He had mocked him. He had dismissed him. He had been so blinded by his own world of wealth and privilege that he couldn't see the brilliant, broken man standing right in front of him. He turned around. His expression was no longer just curious, it was resolute. This isn't over, he said, his voice ringing with a new and powerful conviction. What they did to you, it's not just wrong. It's a waste. A criminal waste of talent and honor. We're going to fix this. Not just for you. For everyone they've left behind. James looked up, a flicker of surprise in his tired eyes. He had expected pity, perhaps a handout, a check to ease the billionaire's conscience. He had not expected this. He had not expected a call to action. What are you proposing? James asked. I'm not sure yet, Davenport admitted. But it starts with you. You don't belong on the street. You belong here. In a lab, solving problems that matter. But first, he paused, an idea forming in his mind, an audacious, almost theatrical plan. First, I have a meeting in less than an hour with the Department of Defense. General Miller is leading the delegation. James's body went rigid at the name. General Wallace Miller? He was the one who signed off on my discharge. I know, Davenport said, a grim smile on his face. I think it's time you had a chance to present your report in person. But you're not going to go looking like this. He pressed a button on his desk. Susan, he said to his assistant, clear my schedule for the next hour. And get the car. We're going shopping. He looked at James, his eyes blazing with a fierce, protective energy. And after we're done with General Miller, we're going to go after Aerodyne, Colonel Bishop, and every single person who buried your report. We're going to get your name back, Sergeant Major. And we're going to do it today. For the first time in 3 years, a spark of the old fire, the warrior's spirit that James Callahan thought had died with his wife, began to rekindle in the depths of his soul. It was a faint spark, but in the rarefied air of Mark Davenport's office, it had more than enough oxygen to burn. The transformation of Sergeant Major James Callahan began in the hushed, carpeted interior of one of the city's most exclusive men's stores. For James, the experience was profoundly disorienting. The last time he had been inside a place like this, the price of a single tie could have fed him for a month. He moved through the racks of expensive suits with the wary, cautious steps of a soldier navigating a minefield. The air smelled of cedar, leather, and wealth, a scent so foreign it was almost suffocating. Mark Davenport, however, was in his element. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who owned the world, and in this small corner of it, he did. He didn't just shop. He commanded. We need a full wardrobe, he told the store manager, a man who had materialized at his elbow the moment they walked in. Everything. Start with a suit. Charcoal gray. Something that says authority, not flash. As assistants scurried to bring options, Davenport turned to James, who was staring at his own reflection in a full-length mirror. He saw a gaunt, weathered man in clothes that hung off his frame. His eyes were the same, but the face they looked out from was a stranger's. It's just a costume, James, Davenport said quietly, sensing his discomfort. The man inside is who's going to win this fight. We just need to make sure they're willing to listen to him first. James nodded, understanding the logic. It was camouflage. He had worn many different kinds of camouflage in his life. This was just another uniform for a different kind of battlefield. An hour later, the transformation was complete. The worn jacket and frayed pants were gone, replaced by a perfectly tailored suit that settled on his shoulders with a familiar weight. A crisp white shirt and a simple, dark blue tie completed the ensemble. His beard had been trimmed, his hair cut. He had even been persuaded to have a shave, revealing the strong jawline that had been hidden for years. When he looked in the mirror again, the stranger was gone. In his place stood a man he recognized, albeit an older, more haunted version. He saw the shadow of the soldier, the engineer, the leader. The years on the street had carved new lines on his face, but they had not extinguished the intelligence in his eyes. If anything, they had added a depth, a gravitas that no expensive suit could ever buy. He stood straighter. His shoulders, which had been slumped under the weight of shame and despair, were now squared. He was Sergeant Major Callahan again. It's a start, James said, his voice a low rumble. Davenport clapped him on the shoulder. It's more than a start. It's a declaration of war. They arrived back at Davenport Aeronautics with 10 minutes to spare. The lobby, which James had only ever seen from the outside, was a cathedral of glass and steel. As they walked toward the executive elevators, employees turned to stare. They saw their dynamic, formidable CO walking side by side with a distinguished-looking stranger who carried himself with the unshakable confidence of a man accustomed to command. No one recognized him as the homeless man who had been the subject of company-wide gossip just 2 hours earlier. The meeting was in the main boardroom. It was a sterile, intimidating space, dominated by a long, polished black table. The members of the Department of Defense delegation were already seated. At the head of the table sat General Wallace Miller. He was a man who looked like he had been carved from granite, with a chest full of ribbons and a face set in a permanent expression of stern authority. He was the man who had personally signed the order that had destroyed James Callahan's life. As Davenport and James entered, General Miller stood up. He extended a hand to Davenport, his eyes flicking dismissively over James. "Mark, good to see you," Miller boomed. "Sorry to hear about the little technical hiccup this morning. Glad your team got it sorted." "We did," Davenport said, his voice cool. He did not take the offered hand, but not without some unexpected assistance. "General, I'd like you to meet the man responsible for saving the Prometheus project. This is Mr. James Callahan." James stepped forward. He met the general's gaze directly. Miller's eyes, cold and blue as a winter sky, scanned James's face. There was a flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps, at this unscheduled addition to the meeting. There was no recognition. To General Miller, Sergeant Major Callahan had ceased to exist 3 years ago. He was a problem that had been solved, a file that had been closed. "Mr. Callahan," Miller said, his tone clipped. "A civilian contractor?" "Not exactly," James replied, his voice calm and steady. It was the voice of a man who had briefed generals and congressmen before. "We have met before, General. Though my uniform was different then." A frown creased Miller's brow. He searched his memory, a vast repository of faces and names. He was a man who prided himself on never forgetting a soldier who had served under his command. "I'm afraid you have me at a disadvantage," the general said stiffly. "My name is Sergeant Major James Callahan," James said, enunciating each word with precision. "Special Projects Division. DARPA. 3 years ago, you signed my discharge papers." The effect of the name was instantaneous and profound. The color drained from General Miller's face. The other members of the delegation shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They all knew the name. The Callahan case had been an ugly, whispered-about affair, a piece of internal business that was supposed to have been buried forever. And now, the ghost they had buried was standing before them, dressed in a $1,000 suit, looking very much alive. "Callahan," Miller stammered. His composure shattered for a fraction of a second before his training kicked in and a mask of cold fury snapped back into place. "What is the meaning of this, Davenport? This is highly irregular." "The meaning, General, is that we have a serious problem," Davenport said, taking charge. He gestured for everyone to sit. James took a seat directly opposite Miller. Davenport remained standing at the head of the table. "This morning," Davenport began, "our prototype experienced a catastrophic malfunction. A harmonic resonance cascade in the power converter. A flaw my own teams, with all their resources, had missed. A flaw that would have, in another 20 minutes, resulted in a multi-billion-dollar explosion on my front lawn." He paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. "The only reason that didn't happen is because Mr. Callahan here happened to be walking by. He diagnosed the problem on site and fixed it in 15 minutes with a basic toolkit. I find myself wondering how he could possibly have done that." Davenport looked at James. "James, perhaps you could enlighten the general." James leaned forward, his hands clasped on the polished table. He looked directly at Miller. "I was able to fix it, General, because it was the exact same design flaw my team identified in the Ethelred prototype 3 years ago. The flaw detailed in the 300-page report I submitted to your office 2 weeks before the incident." General Miller's jaw tightened. "That report was speculative. Your conclusions were not supported by the data." "Not supported?" James's voice rose slightly, the calm demeanor cracking to reveal the cold, righteous anger that had been simmering for 3 years. "2 of my men died because you chose to ignore that report, General. 2 men, whose only mistake was trusting that their commanding officers had read the intelligence and would not put them in unnecessary danger." "That's enough, Sergeant Major," Miller snapped, his authority reasserting itself. The findings of the official inquiry were clear. The incident was the result of procedural missteps on your part. "My procedural missteps?" James shot back, his voice now ringing with the force of a man who had nothing left to lose. "My misstep was writing a report that told you and the CEO of Aerodyne that your billion-dollar pet project was a death trap. My misstep was telling my commanding officer, Colonel Bishop, that he was going to kill someone if he ran that test. The only procedure I violated was the unspoken one, the one that says you don't tell powerful men things they don't want to hear." Davenport stepped forward and placed a slim data tablet on the table. He slid it across the polished surface until it stopped directly in front of General Miller. "That, General," Davenport said, his voice dangerously quiet, is a copy of Sergeant Major Callahan's original report, the one that was supposedly speculative. Alongside it, you will find the complete diagnostic data from the Prometheus this morning. The data shows, conclusively, that the exact failure he predicted 3 years ago is what happened today. The only difference was the outcome. Because this time, the man who wrote the report was there to stop it. Miller stared at the tablet as if it were a venomous snake. He didn't touch it. He knew what it would say. And there's more. Davenport continued, his tone hardening into steel. My legal team has spent the last hour digging. We found something interesting. A series of encrypted emails between your office and the executives at Aerodyne Systems, dated the week after the incident. Emails in which you discuss the need for containment of the Callahan report. Emails in which you conspire to make a good soldier the scapegoat to protect a contractor's profits and a few powerful careers. The air in the room was electric. The other DoD officials looked anywhere but at their commanding officer. They were witnesses to the complete and utter demolition of a powerful man's career. This is an outrage, Miller blustered, but the words were hollow. There was no force behind them. He was cornered. You can't prove any of this. Can't I? Davenport replied with a predatory smile. I've built a multi-billion-dollar company on my ability to find and exploit weaknesses, General. You and your friends at Aerodyne created a very big weakness when you decided to ruin an honorable man's life. You see, I not only have the original report and this morning's data, but I have the man himself. A man who is willing to testify, under oath, in front of a congressional committee, about everything that happened. A man who is now my lead diagnostic engineer. Davenport walked over to James and placed a hand on his shoulder. Sergeant Major Callahan is no longer a ghost you can ignore. He is now an executive of Davenport Aeronautics. He has my resources. He has my protection. And he has my solemn promise that we will not rest until his name is cleared and the men who wronged him are held accountable. General Wallace Miller, a man who had faced down enemies on battlefields across the world, seemed to shrink in his chair. The granite facade had crumbled, revealing the weak, frightened man beneath. He had been outmaneuvered, outgunned, and utterly defeated. Not by an army, but by the truth, delivered by a man he had thrown away and forgotten. James Callahan said nothing. He simply sat there, watching the man who had destroyed his life be brought to justice. He felt no joy, no triumph, only a profound, weary sense of vindication. It was the end of one chapter of his life and the beginning of another. The road back would be long, but for the first time in 3 years, he was no longer walking it alone. Now, Davenport said, his voice returning to a calm, businesslike tone as he addressed the rest of the silent, shocked delegation. Shall we discuss the terms of my company's contract with the Department of Defense? I have a few new conditions. The boardroom felt like a vacuum, all the air sucked out by Davenport's final, devastating pronouncement. General Miller sat frozen, a statue of disgraced power, his career imploding before the shocked eyes of his delegation. Without another word, Davenport gave a curt nod to James. We're done here. They turned and walked out, leaving a shattered silence in their wake. The heavy oak doors closed behind them with a soft, final click, sealing the fate of the men inside. In the hallway, the pristine, corporate quiet felt different. It was no longer the silence of an institution that had excluded James. It was the silence of a world that was now his to command. Are you all right? Davenport asked, his voice losing its sharp, combative edge and softening with genuine concern. James stopped and leaned against the cool glass of the hallway window, looking down at the city below. He had dreamed of this moment for 3 years, played it over and over in the lonely, cold hours of the night. He had imagined it would feel like a victory, a triumphant explosion of joy. But the reality was a quiet, hollow ache. I just put the final nail in the coffin of a man I once respected, James said, his voice barely a whisper. He made a terrible mistake, and instead of owning it, he destroyed lives to cover it up. I don't feel happy about this, Mark. I just feel tired. Justice is heavy work, Davenport replied, standing beside him. It doesn't always feel good, but it's necessary. What you did in there wasn't just for you. It was for those 2 young technicians. It was for every soldier Miller or Bishop ever sent into harm's way without giving them the whole truth. James knew Davenport was right. This was bigger than his own personal tragedy. It was about restoring a broken piece of a system he had once believed in with all his heart. The transition from the street to the executive suite was profoundly jarring. Davenport had arranged a corporate apartment for James, a clean, soullessly modern space with panoramic views and furniture that looked like it had never been touched. The first night, sleep wouldn't come in the soft, king-sized bed. The silence was too loud, the comfort too alien. He ended up on the floor, wrapped in a blanket, the hard surface a more familiar and reassuring presence. The habits of survival were not easily unlearned. His first official day at Davenport Aeronautics was equally strange. He was given a large corner office with a title, Chief Diagnostic Engineer, and a salary that made his head spin. But he spent most of the day not in his new office, but in the lab, standing before the Prometheus prototype. The engineering team, led by David Chun, treated him with a mixture of awe and nervous deference. The legend of the homeless genius had already spread through the company like wildfire. "Mr. Callahan," Chun began cautiously, "we've run the full diagnostic, just as you suggested. You were 100% correct. Call me James," he said, his voice gentle. "You have a brilliant team, Dr. Chun. You just had a blind spot. Everyone does. The trick is to have someone standing at a different angle to help you see it." He spent the rest of the day with them, his suit jacket off, his sleeves rolled up. He didn't lecture or command. He asked questions. He listened. He sketched complex equations on whiteboards with a fluid grace that left the PhDs in the room mesmerized. He spoke their language, the universal language of physics and the relentless pursuit of an elegant solution. By day's end, the awe had been replaced by a deep and genuine respect. He wasn't a legend, he was one of them. And he was brilliant. That evening, in his silent apartment, he finally unpacked his old army backpack. He took out the worn photograph of his wife, Sarah. For 3 years, looking at her smiling face had been an exercise in pain. But tonight, he saw not just loss, but the love and belief she'd always had in him. "You can fix anything, Jimmy," she used to say. He placed the photo on the empty nightstand. "I'm trying, Sarah," he whispered to the silence. "I'm trying to fix me, too." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. True to his word, Davenport unleashed a legal and media firestorm. The story of the forgotten hero became a national headline. The fallout was swift. General Miller was forced into a dishonorable retirement. A full-scale congressional investigation was launched into Aerodyne Systems. Colonel Bishop was court-martialed. James's name was officially cleared, his back pay and pension restored. Apologies came from all corners. But James found that external validation did little to heal the internal wounds. Justice was not the same as peace. He found his peace in the work. He threw himself into his role, his mind, starved for so long, now feasting on complex challenges. He wasn't just a diagnostician, he was an innovator. One afternoon, he was sketching an idea for a new type of energy dampener when Davenport walked into his office. "Aerodyne wants to settle," he said, tossing a folder onto the desk. "It's a 9-figure number." James didn't look at it. "We're not taking it." Davenport smiled. "No, we're not. But that's not what I came to talk about." He gestured to the schematics. "What's this?" "An idea," James said. "A predictive system, not a reactive one." "It's brilliant," Davenport said. "But James, is this what you want? To spend the rest of your life building better machines for my company?" The question hung in the air. "When you were out there, you told me you spent every day in the public library. Who else was there?" James pictured the quiet, sunlit rooms. "All sorts," he said. "People, like me. People with nowhere else to go. A lot of them were smart. You could see it. They didn't have a door back into the world." A powerful, clarifying thought took shape. The real design flaw wasn't in the Prometheus. It was in the system that built it. A system that could look at a man like him and see only trash. "The greatest waste," James said, his voice filled with a sudden, passionate certainty. "The most profound inefficiency I have ever seen is the waste of human potential. We build these incredible machines, but we overlook the geniuses who could be designing them, simply because they don't have the right address or the right suit." He stood to join Davenport at the window. "I fixed your machine, Mark. You helped me get my name back. But that's not enough. How many other James Callahans are out there right now, sleeping under a bridge?" Davenport saw the leader he had recognized from the beginning. "So what do we do about it, Sergeant Major?" "We build a new machine," James said, his eyes blazing with a purpose that dwarfed personal vindication. Not of metal and wires, but a machine for finding people. A foundation. We seek out the overlooked, the discarded, the forgotten. We don't give them a handout. We give them a chance. We invest in them. It was the ultimate engineering challenge, to fix a broken part of the world. Mark Davenport extended his hand. I think, he said, a broad, genuine smile spreading across his face. You've just found your next special project. And this time, you'll have an unlimited budget. James took his hand, his grip firm. It was a handshake that sealed not a business deal, but a promise. A promise to turn pain into purpose. 2 years passed. The Callahan-Davenport Initiative, or the CDI, was no longer just an idea. It was a sprawling, vibrant reality. They had transformed an abandoned warehouse, a symbol of urban decay, into a beacon of renewal. The CDI wasn't a shelter. It was an ecosystem. It offered housing, medical care, and counseling, but its core was the Innovation Lab, James Callahan's domain. It was a massive workshop filled with state-of-the-art tools, computers, and quiet rooms for study, open 24/7 to its residents. The only price of admission was a desire to learn and to build. James walked through the lab, the quiet hum of machinery a comforting symphony. He no longer wore expensive suits, preferring the simple uniform of an engineer at work. Here, he was simply chief, a title of respect and affection given to him by the residents. He stopped at a workstation where a young woman named Maya was hunched over a complex architectural model. 6 months ago, she had arrived haunted and homeless, clutching a portfolio of breathtaking designs for sustainable housing. She had the vision of a master architect, but had been chewed up and spit out by the system. The load-bearing calculations on the central arch look a little tight, Maya, James said softly. She looked up, her eyes, once clouded with fear, now bright with intellectual fire. I know, Chief. The standard materials won't work. But I was reading one of the journals you left out. There's a new carbon fiber composite. If we weave it into the recycled concrete mix, it should increase the tensile strength by 300%. James looked at the math. It was flawless. That's brilliant, he said, pride in his voice. Let me worry about the budget. You just keep designing things that are impossible. It's our job to make them possible. He continued his rounds, seeing a former accountant who had lost everything now learning cybersecurity, and a group of foster care youths building an app to help others like them. This was the true output of the CDI, not patents or prototypes, but people rediscovering their own worth. Later that day, he stood on the roof with Mark Davenport, looking out at the city skyline. The CDI had changed Mark, too, igniting in him a passion for philanthropy that went beyond writing checks. General Miller sent me a letter, Davenport said, breaking the comfortable silence. To apologize. He's retired now, volunteers his time. He said a leader's real legacy isn't the battles he wins, but the people he takes care of. He said to tell you he was sorry he forgot that. James was quiet for a long time, surprised to find that the rage and bitterness that had been his only companions for 3 years were gone. In their place was a quiet, profound sense of peace. The past could not be changed, but the future was something he was actively, joyfully building. Good, James said simply. I hope he finds his own way to fix things. Down below, in the city he now saw as a garden of hidden talent, the work continued. A new life was being rebuilt. The man forgotten by the world had not only found his way back into it, but was now redesigning it, making it a place where no one else would have to offer their genius for the simple price of a meal. His work was far from over, but Sergeant Major James Callahan, the architect of second chances, was finally home. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. We are always trying to improve our stories, so feel free to also drop your feedback in the comment section below. Thanks for spending this time with me.